The radio crackled with static, then silence. Colonel Marcus Reeves pressed the handset against his ear, straining to hear anything beyond the white noise that had replaced Bravo Company's last transmission. 3 minutes ago, they'd been screaming for immediate air support. Now, nothing but the desert wind and the distant rumble of incoming mortars that grew closer with each passing second. Viper Base, this is Kodiak 6. I need that CAS now, Reeves barked into his mic, sweat beading despite the pre-dawn chill. His forward operating base sat like a concrete island in the Syrian wasteland, surrounded by rolling hills that concealed God knew how many hostile forces. Intelligence had been wrong, again. What was supposed to be a routine supply convoy escort had turned into a full-scale ambush, and his men were dying out there in the dark. The response came through layers of static. Kodiak 6, Viper Base. Nearest available air support is 2 hours out. Repeat, 2 hours. 2 hours. Reeves closed his eyes, calculating rapidly. At the current rate of fire, his perimeter would be overrun in 30 minutes. The ammunition depot they were guarding contained enough ordnance to level half of Damascus if it fell into the wrong hands. Failure wasn't an option, but neither was survival, not without air support. Then he heard it, a sound that shouldn't exist, not here, not now. The distinctive whine of turbofan engines, low and growing louder. Reeves looked up, squinting against the stars, and saw nothing but endless black sky. But the sound was unmistakable, an aircraft approaching from the south, flying dark without navigation lights. Viper Base, I've got an unidentified aircraft inbound. Are you showing anything on radar? Negative, Kodiak 6. Airspace is clear. The whine grew louder, and suddenly the darkness erupted in a chain of orange flashes. The distinctive BRRRT of a GAU-8 Avenger cannon split the night like thunder, each burst lasting exactly 2 seconds. Professional, controlled, devastating. Enemy muzzle flashes that had been winking from the hills like deadly fireflies began winking out, one by one. What the hell? Reeves breathed into his mic. Kodiak 6, this is Reaper 27. I heard you boys needed a house call. The voice that came through his headset was calm, almost conversational, with the slightest hint of a southern drawl. More importantly, it was unmistakably female, a rarity in the close air support community, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. Reaper 27, identify yourself. You're not on my air tasking order. Roger that, Kodiak. I was returning from a different party when I monitored your frequency. Thought you might appreciate the neighborhood watch. Another burst from the cannon, another enemy position silenced forever. The impossible had arrived, and she was speaking in riddles. Captain Victoria, Reaper Kastner, had been flying for 6 hours straight, her A-10C Thunderbolt II burning fuel at an alarming rate as she returned from a failed reconnaissance mission deep in enemy territory. The intel had been bad, a recurring theme lately, and she'd spent most of the night loitering over empty desert, watching for targets that never materialized. She should have been halfway back to Al Dafra Air Base by now, but something about the panic in the ground controller's voice had made her deviate from course. Radio chatter between units wasn't supposed to bleed over onto different frequencies, but atmospheric conditions could do strange things to radio waves. When she'd heard Kodiak 6's desperate calls for air support, military protocol said to maintain course and let someone else handle it. Protocol could go to hell. Kastner banked her aircraft into a lazy left turn, eyes scanning the infrared display on her targeting pod. The thermal imaging painted a clear picture of the battlefield below, scattered heat signatures that had to be friendly forces, clustered around what looked like a forward operating base, surrounded by a much larger number of signatures that were decidedly unfriendly. Kodiak 6, Reaper 27. I show multiple heat signatures converging on your position from the north and east. Are those your guys or the other guys? Definitely the other guys, Reaper. We've got about 200 hostiles with mortars, RPGs, and what looks like at least one technical with a mounted .50 cal. Kastner whistled softly. 200 against maybe 30 defenders, not good odds by anyone's standard. She adjusted her altitude to 15,000 feet, high enough to stay out of range of small arms fire, but low enough to maintain visual contact with her targets. Roger that, Kodiak. I'm going to need you to mark your friendlies with IR strobes if you've got them. I don't want any blue-on-blue incidents on my conscience. Copy, Reaper. Strobes are active. Through her night vision, Kastner could see the tiny pinpricks of infrared light blinking from the base's perimeter, invisible to the naked eye but clear as day through her equipment. She selected her first target, a cluster of heat signatures about 800 meters north of the friendlies, grouped around what looked like a mortar position. Kodiak 6, Danger Close Fire Mission. Troops in contact 200 meters north of your position. Clear to engage. Reaper 2-7, you are cleared hot. Give 'em hell. Kastner rolled inverted and pulled her stick back, diving toward the earth at nearly 400 knots. The A-10 wasn't built for grace or speed. It was built to kill tanks and deliver punishment to anyone stupid enough to threaten American ground forces. As she approached her attack angle, she could see muzzle flashes from the enemy positions, bright white blooms in her night vision that marked each shot fired at the trapped soldiers below. Time to even the odds. The first burst from her GAU-8 cannon sent 30mm depleted uranium rounds screaming earthward at 4,200 rounds per minute. Each round weighed nearly a pound and could punch through 2 inches of rolled steel armor. Against unprotected infantry, the effect was apocalyptic. The enemy mortar position simply ceased to exist, replaced by a smoking crater and scattered debris. Good hits, came Kodiak 6's voice over the radio, excitement creeping through the professional calm. You just took out their primary indirect fire support. Kastner was already banking for her second pass, selecting another target cluster on the eastern side of the perimeter. This one looked bigger, maybe 20 fighters grouped around what her targeting pod identified as a vehicle-mounted weapon system. Kodiak 6, I've got eyes on a technical with what looks like a heavy machine gun, bearing 085 from your position. Engaging now. She rolled into another attack run, this time approaching from the east to avoid flying over the friendly forces. The technical was clearly visible now, a Toyota pickup with a .50 caliber machine gun mounted in the bed, currently pouring fire into the base's defensive positions. The A-10's cannon spoke again, and the technical vanished in a ball of orange flame as its fuel tank detonated. Secondary explosions suggested they'd been carrying ammunition as well. Outstanding, Reaper. You're giving these bastards a real education in close air support. Despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, Kastner found herself smiling. It had been too long since she'd had the opportunity to do what she'd been trained for, to be the guardian angel that ground forces called upon when the situation looked hopeless. But as she pulled out of her second attack run and gained altitude for a better view of the battlefield, she realized the fight was far from over. From her vantage point at 12,000 feet, Kastner could see the tactical situation developing in real time. The enemy forces weren't just attacking blindly. They were coordinating their assault, using the cover of darkness and superior numbers to systematically probe the base's defenses. Every time she eliminated one threat, 2 more seemed to take its place. Kodiak 6, I'm seeing movement from the west now. Looks like they're trying to flank your position while I'm busy with the northern approach. Roger that, Reaper. We've got eyes on them too. Can you service that target? Kastner checked her ammunition counter. She'd expended nearly 400 rounds already, leaving her with roughly 900 rounds of 30 ammunition. In a prolonged engagement against this many targets, she'd need to be more selective with her shots. Affirm, Kodiak, but I need to conserve ammunition. I'm going to switch to rockets for area targets and save the gun for precision work. She selected one of her Hydra 70 rocket pods and painted the western approach with her targeting laser. The rockets weren't as accurate as the cannon, but against massed infantry in the open, they'd be devastating. Kodiak 6, rocket attack inbound on the western approach. Keep your heads down. The salvo of 2.75-inch rockets streaked down from the darkness like falling stars, each one carrying a 17-pound high-explosive warhead. They impacted across a 100-meter area, turning the enemy's flanking maneuver into chaos. Through her thermal imaging, Kastner watched heat signatures scatter like startled insects, their coordinated attack dissolving into panicked retreat. But even as she scored another tactical victory, a new voice crackled over the radio, one that made her blood run cold. All aircraft, this is Hammer Control. Reaper 27, you are ordered to return to base immediately. You are operating outside your assigned area of operations without authorization. Kastner's jaw tightened. She'd been expecting this call eventually. Her deviation from course wouldn't go unnoticed by the command structure. But she'd hoped to finish the job before the bureaucrats started throwing their weight around. Hammer Control, Reaper 27. I have troops in contact requiring immediate close air support. No other assets available. Reaper 27, we have Viper flight en route to your position. RTB immediately. Kastner glanced at her fuel gauge. She had maybe 20 minutes of station time left before she'd have to break off for fuel anyway. But Viper flight was the F-16 squadron from Qatar. They'd take at least 90 minutes to reach this position, and that was assuming they'd been scrambled immediately. The men on the ground didn't have 90 minutes. Hammer Control, Reaper 27, unable to comply at this time. I have visual on enemy forces massing for a final assault. If I leave now, these guys are dead. The radio went silent for a long moment. When Hammer Control came back, there was steel in the controller's voice. Reaper 27, you are in direct violation of operational orders. Return to base immediately or face court-martial proceedings. Kastner looked down at the infrared strobes marking the friendly positions below, then at the hundreds of heat signatures still moving through the hills around them. She thought about the voices she'd heard on the radio, young men, scared but determined, fighting for their lives in the middle of nowhere. She keyed her mic. Hammer Control, Reaper 27. Message received and understood. I'll be happy to discuss this with you when these soldiers are safe. She switched frequencies back to Kodiak 6's channel and heard Colonel Reeves' voice immediately. Reaper, I heard that transmission. You don't have to do this. We can hold until the F-16s get here. Kastner banked into another attack run, selecting a new target cluster that was advancing under cover of a wadi to the south. Negative Kodiak. Nobody gets left behind, that includes you. The enemy had regrouped faster than she'd expected, and they were adapting to her tactics. Instead of massing in large groups that made easy targets, they were now advancing in small teams of 3 or 4 fighters, using natural cover and coordinated movement to make themselves harder to track and engage. It was time to get creative. Kastner climbed to 18,000 feet and began a wide orbit around the battlefield, using her targeting pod to track individual enemy movements. She'd learned this technique during her deployment in Afghanistan, patience hunting, they called it. Instead of diving in with guns blazing, she'd wait for the perfect shot, then eliminate key targets with surgical precision. Through her infrared display, she watched an enemy squad attempting to set up a mortar position in a depression about 600 meters from the base. They thought they were hidden, but thermal imaging revealed their body heat against the cool desert sand. She rolled inverted and dove, lining up for a gun run that would take her directly over their position. At 2,000 feet, she squeezed the trigger for exactly 1 second, just enough to send a stream of 30 rounds into the mortar team's hiding spot. Direct hit, the enemy squad ceased to exist. "Nice shooting, Reaper," came Kodiak Six's voice. "How'd you even see them?" "Trade secret, Colonel. I've got eyes like a hawk and a disposition to match." It was a line she'd used before, and it usually got a chuckle from ground controllers. But something about the way she said it now, with enemy rounds still crackling through the air below, made it sound less like bragging and more like a simple statement of fact. She was good at this. Damn good. And these soldiers were alive because of skills she'd spent years perfecting, flying missions that most pilots considered too dangerous or too boring to bother with. The A-10 wasn't a glamorous aircraft. It was slow, ugly, and designed around a gun that was older than most of the pilots who flew it. But in situations like this, when American lives hung in the balance and every second counted, there was nothing else in the world she'd rather be flying. "Kodiak 6, I've got movement from multiple directions now. They're coordinating for a final push. How's your ammunition situation?" "Not great, Reaper. We're down to maybe 10 minutes of sustained fire, then we're throwing rocks." 10 minutes. Kastner checked her own ammunition status. 600 rounds of 30, one rocket pod remaining, and fuel for maybe 15 more minutes of combat operations. She'd have to make every shot count. But as she began selecting her next target, something on her radar display made her blood run cold. 2 new contacts, approaching from the north at high speed. Enemy air support had just entered the fight. The radar contacts were moving fast, too fast to be helicopters, but the wrong profile for fixed-wing aircraft. Kastner's threat warning receiver remained silent, which meant whatever was approaching either wasn't emitting radar signals or was using frequencies her equipment couldn't detect. "Kodiak 6, I've got 2 unknown aircraft approaching from the north. Are you expecting any friendly air assets?" "Negative, Reaper. All our birds are accounted for." Kastner's mind raced through the possibilities. Enemy fighters were unlikely this far from major population centers, but the insurgent groups operating in this region had been known to acquire military hardware through less than official channels. More likely, these were attack helicopters, Mi-24 Hinds, or maybe even captured American Blackhawks modified for ground attack. Either way, they'd turn the tide of battle in seconds if she didn't do something about them. "Kodiak 6, I'm going to investigate these contacts, maintain defensive positions, and be ready to mark targets of opportunity." She banked north and climbed to 20,000 feet, switching her radar to air-to-air mode. The A-10 wasn't designed as a fighter. It was built to kill tanks and support ground troops, but it carried AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles for self-defense, and Kastner had trained extensively in air-to-air combat during her years as an instructor pilot. The contacts were clearer now, 2 helicopters flying in formation, approaching the battlefield at maximum speed. Through her targeting pod, she could make out the distinctive silhouette of Mi-24 Hinds, Russian-built attack helicopters that were as heavily armed as they were heavily armored. This was about to get interesting. The Hinds were flying low, using the terrain to mask their approach until the last possible moment. It was a sound tactical decision that would normally have given them the element of surprise. But Kastner had the high ground and better sensors, which meant she could see them long before they knew she was there. She selected one of her Sidewinder missiles and began stalking the lead helicopter, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The AIM-9 was a heat-seeking missile that locked onto the infrared signature of jet engines or helicopter turbines. Against the cool desert air, the Hinds engine exhausts would stand out like beacons. The familiar tone of a missile lock filled her headset, and Kastner smiled grimly. "Fox 2. The Sidewinder streaked away from her wing rail like a white-hot arrow, covering the distance to its target in seconds. The lead hind never knew what hit it. One moment it was flying toward the battlefield. The next it was a ball of orange flame tumbling toward the desert floor. The second helicopter immediately began evasive maneuvers, jinking left and right while climbing rapidly to gain altitude. Its pilot was good, probably an experienced combat veteran who'd survived more than one encounter with enemy air defenses. Unfortunately for him, Victoria Kastner was better. She rolled her A-10 inverted and pulled hard, diving toward the remaining hind while selecting her second and final sidewinder. The helicopter pilot saw her coming and began a violent defensive spiral, trying to defeat any missile lock she might achieve. But Kastner wasn't planning to use a missile. At 3,000 feet, she rolled upright and lined up the fleeing helicopter in her cannon sight. The GAU-8 Avenger wasn't just effective against ground targets. Its depleted uranium rounds could punch through helicopter armor like tissue paper. The hind pilot realized his mistake too late. He'd focused so intently on defeating missile attacks that he'd forgotten about the most basic threat in air-to-air combat: the gun. Kastner squeezed the trigger for 2 seconds. The 13 rounds caught the helicopter in its engine compartment, and it immediately began auto-rotating toward the ground in a cloud of black smoke and scattered debris. Kodiak 6, aerial threats eliminated. 2 enemy attack helicopters down. You should have a clear sky for the next few minutes. Outstanding work, Reaper. You just saved our bacon up here. But even as Colonel Reeves expressed his gratitude, Kastner was already turning her attention back to the ground battle. The enemy forces had used the helicopter attack as cover for their own advance, and they were now less than 200 meters from the base perimeter. It was time to end this fight. With her air-to-air missiles expended and her cannon ammunition running low, Kastner had to make a tactical decision. She could continue flying gun runs against individual targets, picking off enemy fighters one by one until her ammunition was exhausted. Or she could use her remaining rocket pod in a single devastating strike that might break the enemy's will to fight. She chose the latter. Kodiak 6, I'm going to lay down a wall of fire between your position and the advancing enemy forces. When I do, I need your boys to come up shooting. This is our chance to break their assault. Roger that, Reaper. We'll be ready. Kastner selected her final rocket pod and began plotting her attack run. She'd approach from the west, flying parallel to the base perimeter at exactly 500 meters distance. The rockets would create a barrier of high explosive between the friendlies and the advancing enemy, giving the defenders a chance to counterattack, while the surviving hostiles were still stunned and disoriented. It was a risky maneuver that required split-second timing and absolute precision. Too close to the friendlies and she'd kill her own people. Too far from the enemy and the rockets would be ineffective. She rolled into her final attack run, diving toward the desert floor at nearly 450 knots. Through her heads-up display, she could see the infrared strobes marking friendly positions, now almost overrun by the advancing enemy forces. At 1,500 feet, she fired her entire rocket pod in a single salvo, 19 2.75-inch rockets that screamed downward in a perfect line parallel to the base perimeter. They impacted in a series of orange flashes that lit up the night sky, each explosion creating a crater 10 meters across. The effect on the enemy assault was immediate and devastating. The coordinated advance dissolved into chaos as fighters scattered in every direction, seeking cover from the rain of steel and high explosive that had suddenly appeared between them and their objective. Now Kodiak hit them while they're disorganized. The base's defensive positions erupted in muzzle flashes as every available weapon opened fire on the scattered enemy forces. Machine guns, rifles, and even pistols poured fire into the confused mass of fighters who moments before had been on the verge of overrunning the American position. The battle lasted exactly 3 minutes. When the firing stopped, the desert was quiet except for the distant sound of vehicles retreating toward the horizon. Reaper 27, Kodiak 6, enemy forces are withdrawing. I don't know how to thank you. Kastner circled overhead at 8,000 feet, watching the thermal signatures of surviving enemy fighters fade into the distance. Her fuel gauge showed 15 minutes to bingo fuel, just enough to make it back to base if she left immediately. No thanks necessary, Kodiak, just doing my job. But as she turned south toward home, she knew that wasn't entirely true. Her job had been to fly reconnaissance over empty desert and return to base without incident. Everything that had happened in the last hour had been her choice, a decision to ignore orders and risk her career for a group of soldiers she'd never met. Looking back, she wouldn't change a thing. The flight back to Al-Dafra Air Base gave Kastner time to think about what had just happened, and more importantly, what was going to happen when she landed. Disobeying direct orders in combat wasn't something the Air Force took lightly, especially when those orders came from operational headquarters. She'd saved 30 American lives tonight, but that might not be enough to save her career. The radio crackled as she approached the base perimeter, and she recognized the voice of Major Sarah Chen, her squadron operations officer. Reaper 27, Al-Dafra Tower. You're cleared for immediate landing, runway 27. Report to squadron headquarters as soon as you're on the ground. Roger, Al-Dafra, Reaper 27 inbound. The landing was routine, textbook approach, perfect touchdown, minimal rollout. But as Kastner taxied toward the maintenance ramp, she could see a crowd waiting for her. Ground crew, maintenance personnel, other pilots, and in the center of the group, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, her squadron commander. His expression was unreadable, but his body language suggested this wasn't going to be a congratulatory welcome home. Kastner shut down her engines and went through her post-flight checklist with methodical precision. Whatever was about to happen, she wanted her aircraft properly secured and ready for the next pilot. The A-10 had performed flawlessly tonight, and it deserved better treatment than being abandoned in haste. When she finally climbed down from the cockpit, Colonel Morrison was waiting at the bottom of the crew ladder. "Captain Kastner, you and I need to have a conversation right now." "Yes, sir." As they walked toward the squadron building, Kastner could hear the ground crew discussing her aircraft's condition. Minimal damage, all systems functional, but nearly empty ammunition bays and fuel tanks that told their own story about the night's activities. Morrison's office was sparse and functional, decorated only with unit patches and a few photographs from his own combat deployments. He gestured for Kastner to take a seat, then closed the door and activated a white noise generator that would prevent their conversation from being overheard. "Captain, what you did tonight was either the most heroic thing I've seen in 20 years of military service, or the most monumentally stupid violation of orders in Air Force history. I'm still trying to decide which." Kastner met his gaze steadily. "Sir, American soldiers were in danger. I had the capability to help them. I helped them. You also ignored direct orders from operational headquarters, deviated from your assigned mission profile, and engaged enemy forces without authorization. Any one of those things could end your career." "I understand that, sir." Morrison leaned back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. "Do you? Because I'm not sure you realize what kind of firestorm is heading your way. There are people at very high levels who are extremely unhappy with your decision-making tonight. With respect, sir, I'd rather face a court-martial than explain to 30 families why their sons and husbands died while I flew home with a full load of ammunition." For the first time since she'd entered his office, Morrison smiled. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." He opened a folder on his desk and pulled out a sheet of paper that Kastner recognized as an official military message. "This came in about an hour ago, direct from Central Command. It seems that Colonel Reeves has some friends in very high places, friends who are extremely grateful for what you did tonight." Morrison handed her the message, and Kastner read it with growing surprise. It was a commendation request, signed by a brigadier general she'd never heard of, recommending her for the Distinguished Flying Cross. "Sir, I don't understand," I thought. "You thought you were in trouble, and you were, right up until this message arrived. It seems that the ammunition depot you helped save tonight contained something more than standard ordnance. Something that certain people really didn't want falling into enemy hands." Morrison stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the aircraft parked on the flight line. "Captain, I've been flying combat missions for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did tonight. Single aircraft, against overwhelming odds, making tactical decisions in real time while under fire. It was textbook close air support executed by someone who clearly knows her business." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet, because while you're not going to face court-martial proceedings, you are going to face something that might be even worse." Kastner felt her stomach clench. "Sir." Morrison turned back to face her, and his expression was completely serious. "You're going to become famous." The next morning, Kastner woke to find her world completely changed. The story of the lone A-10 pilot who'd saved an entire forward operating base had somehow leaked to the media, and her unofficial call sign, Reaper, was already becoming a household name. CNN was calling her the Angel of Death. Fox News had dubbed her America's Guardian Angel, and social media was exploding with hashtags like Reaper27 and Nobody Gets Left Behind. She'd become a symbol overnight, a representation of everything people wanted to believe about American military forces: courage, competence, and an absolute refusal to abandon fellow soldiers in their hour of need. The problem was, she wasn't comfortable being a symbol. She was just a pilot who'd done her job, and all the media attention felt like a violation of the quiet professionalism she'd always tried to maintain. Knock, knock. Major Chen appeared in the doorway of Kastner's quarters, holding a cup of coffee and wearing an expression of barely contained amusement. "Sarah, please tell me this isn't as bad as it looks." "Oh, it's worse. Much worse. You've got interview requests from every major network, 3 movie studios want to buy your life story, and someone started a Wikipedia page about you that already has more information than your official service record." Kastner groaned and pulled a pillow over her head. "There's more. The Air Force Public Affairs Office wants to fly you back to the Pentagon for a media tour. Something about showcasing the professionalism and dedication of America's airmen." "Can I just go back to flying combat missions instead?" "Afraid not. You're too valuable as a public relations asset now. Besides, after last night's performance, every ground commander in theater is going to be requesting you specifically for close air support missions. You've become the pilot everyone wants watching their six." Chen sat down on the edge of the bed and handed Kastner the coffee. "Look, I know this isn't what you signed up for, but maybe it's time to embrace it. You've got a platform now, a chance to show people what military aviation is really about, what we really do out here." Kastner sat up and took a sip of coffee, thinking about Chen's words. She'd spent her entire career trying to prove herself in a male-dominated field, fighting for every opportunity to show that she could do the job as well as anyone. Now, suddenly, the entire world was watching. What if I screw it up? What if I say the wrong thing and make us all look bad? Then you'll be human just like the rest of us, but I don't think you'll screw it up. You've got too much integrity for that." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Morrison's voice carried through the thin walls. "Kastner, you've got visitors, VIP types. Better get dressed." 10 minutes later, Kastner found herself in Morrison's office, facing 2 men in expensive suits who introduced themselves as representatives from the Department of Defense. They had a proposition for her: a temporary reassignment to the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office, where she'd serve as a spokesperson for combat aviation programs. "It's a career opportunity, Captain. the older of the two men explained. A chance to influence policy at the highest levels of government, to ensure that programs like the A-10 continue to receive funding and support. With respect, sir, I'm a pilot, not a politician. Sometimes, Captain, being an effective pilot means being willing to fight battles on the ground as well as in the air. It was a compelling argument, but Kastner couldn't shake the feeling that accepting the assignment would mean abandoning the work she'd trained her entire adult life to do. I need time to think about it. Of course, but don't take too long. The news cycle moves fast and opportunities like this don't last forever. That evening, Kastner found herself alone on the flight line, walking among the aircraft that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. The A-10s sat silent in the desert air, their angular shapes softened by the golden light of sunset. She stopped beside her own aircraft, tail number 780691, and ran her hand along the titanium armor that surrounded the cockpit. This morning, this plane had been her weapon, her shield, and her lifeline all at once. Tomorrow, it might just be a museum piece if budget cuts and political pressure continued to threaten the program. Maybe the Pentagon assignment wasn't such a bad idea after all. Thought I might find you out here. Kastner turned to see Colonel Reeves approaching across the tarmac. He looked older than he had sounded over the radio, maybe 50, with gray hair and the weathered complexion of someone who'd spent most of his career in desert environments. Colonel, what brings you to Al Dafra? Wanted to thank you in person and to deliver something. He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a squadron patch, Bravo Company, 2nd Infantry Regiment, along with a handwritten note signed by 31 different soldiers. They wanted you to have that. It's not much, but it comes from 31 men who are going home to their families because of what you did last night. Kastner felt her throat tighten as she read some of the messages. Simple words of gratitude from soldiers who understood better than anyone the thin line between life and death in combat. Thank you, sir. This means more than any medal ever could. I also wanted to tell you something else, something that might help you make whatever decision you're wrestling with. Reeves gestured toward the aircraft around them. These machines, this technology, the training and tactics, none of it matters without people like you willing to use it when it counts. The bureaucrats and politicians can debate budgets and policy all they want, but at the end of the day, it comes down to individual pilots making individual decisions in the cockpit. What are you saying, Colonel? I'm saying that maybe the best way to serve your country right now isn't in a cockpit. Maybe it's in a conference room in Washington, making sure that future pilots have the tools and support they need to do what you did last night. Kastner looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, other pilots were flying other missions, facing their own impossible decisions and living with the consequences. You think I should take the Pentagon assignment? I think you should do whatever feels right. But I also think that sometimes the most important battles are fought far from any battlefield. 2 weeks later, Captain Victoria Reaper Kastner reported for duty at the Pentagon, wearing her dress blue uniform and carrying the squadron patch from Bravo Company in her pocket. The assignment was temporary, just 6 months, but she suspected it might change the trajectory of her entire career. Her new office was on the 3rd floor of the E-Ring, with a view of the Potomac River and the Virginia skyline beyond. It was a long way from the cockpit of an A-10, but as she settled into her new role as a combat aviation advocate, she began to understand the different kind of impact she might be able to make. The congressional hearing on defense appropriations was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and the A-10 program was once again on the chopping block. Budget hawks argued that the aging aircraft was obsolete in an era of stealth technology and precision-guided munitions. Military reformers countered that close air support aircraft like the A-10, remained essential for supporting ground troops in irregular warfare environments. Kastner's testimony would be crucial in determining the program's future. She spent the weekend preparing, reviewing technical specifications, cost analyses, and operational reports from commanders throughout the combat theater. But she knew that the most important part of her testimony wouldn't come from any briefing book or PowerPoint presentation. It would come from the memory of 31 soldiers who had gone home to their families because she'd been flying an A-10 on a dark night in Syria. On Tuesday morning, she walked into